All right. Where is everyone today? Asleep. Asleep. That's a good answer. All right. Since there's only 5 of you, gather yourselves together in a group in the middle and share with one another what you thought of the examples of student writing, which are examples of Paul writing things. So just go through them amongst yourselves, example by example, and say, okay, was this plagiarized? Why did I think it was plagiarized? What type of plagiarism it is, et cetera, et cetera. See if you guys all agree on kind of what you've concluded.
Just highlighted the whole name.
An example 1, he quoted the whole book, but he didn't cite it right. Example 2 is just really consistent.
Well, I hear 2 people having a conversation about what they thought.
I've been trying to pull mine up, and
Okay.
I'm just not getting it.
Okay.
So which one are we on?
Just start at the top and work your way down. That's the easiest thing to do.
I mean, the first one, I can't remember if you guys talked about this one already, but he's using quotations, but not.
He's not citing, yeah.
Mhm.
So let's actually, since there's so few of us here, let's just talk about them as a group. So here's the first one. That's stuff. Why is that not presenting? So here's the first one, and you guys are saying that this is plagiarism. Why?
Because
Look. Okay. Why? Why always this room? This is the only room that I ever have difficulties in. And it's the only one where my computer like totally locks up. Nope, there it is. All right. So this is example 1. Why do you think that's plagiarized?
Because, I mean, the quotations wasn't wrong, but he doesn't cite, I mean, he's, at the beginning, he states where he got it, but he
Okay.
doesn't cite again or use the correct format.
So in things that you've read, in articles that you've read, in things that you've read in books and things like this, do you have to put a citation on every sentence?
I don't think you do, but I guess the problem is that most of it is just from the article.
Oh yeah, it's all a bunch of quotes strung
Yeah.
together. There's nothing original from the student's writing in it. So as long as it's clear that the information that comes after the citation is still from that same source, you can go ahead and put a citation in every sentence. But but then it just gets kind of redundant because it's obvious from the way you've written it that this is all from this one source. In this case, what is it, like 3 sentences? 1, 2, it's 2 sentences. So it's clear from the way this is written that this is all coming from Young et al. So I wouldn't make you put a citation in every sentence because the flow of the writing makes it clear that it's from a single source. So in this case, they cited the source, they put the direct quotes in quotations, so they're giving credit to the original author's voice and way of using language, which is another thing you want to avoid doing, is stealing someone's voice. So would this be plagiarism?
Yes.
Yeah.
Why?
Could you just put a link to the article?
Well, they could have just put a link to the article, but did they violate the creativity of the person?
No.
No.
He states that he got his quotations are from Young.
Yeah, basically put it in quotation marks, indicating that that's the original verbiage of the original author, so you're not robbing that person of their creativity, their ability to write well, et cetera, et cetera. Are you robbing them of their ideas? No, because you gave them credit for it. In my mind, this would not be plagiarism, because they followed all the rules. Now, it's really crappy writing. You'll get an F for that, because you're a really crappy writer. What you won't get is a 0 and an honor code violation, because you followed all the rules. But following all the rules, that just really isn't sufficient if you're going to develop into being a good writer. You actually want to be able to write well. And so you would fail the assignment if you wrote an entire paper like this because you're a really crappy writer. You would not get an honor code violation and a 0 because you plagiarized. Because in my mind, this isn't plagiarism. Now, according to turnitin.org, it is plagiarism. It was what they would call aggregator. But once again, you've done everything you're supposed to do. You have put quotations around the original verbiage from the paper when you were using the original verbiage from the paper, and you have cited the information source appropriately, which is kind of what you're supposed to do. But it's the bare minimum of what you're supposed to do in academic writing in college. So I would not classify this as plagiarism. I would classify it as crappy writing and probably give you an F. What about the second one? Now you're afraid to answer because I said you were wrong on the first one.
Say plagiarism.
Hmm?
I would say probably plagiarism.
Okay, plagiarism. Why do you think it's plagiarized? What exactly is it that you think is plagiarized and where? And what's the type?
So I guess you just can't tell what parts are from Young and what parts are original.
Well, it's all from Young, so it's all
Is it?
it's all summarizing this paper. So if you're writing, so you guys have to summarize the National Academy of Science report. So everything that you get, for the most part, is probably going to be from the National Academy of Science report. The tricky thing, the hard thing about writing this letter, what's that?
I mean, I just used a lot that wasn't in it, I guess, but.
Did you? Oh, you've already started writing your letter to your Aunt Susie?
No, I mean, just to give history on genetic engineering wasn't part of the article we wrote, but I made 2 slides on it. I don't know, but I guess it just depends.
Yeah, I suspect you're going to be relying fairly heavily on the report. So the trick is, how do you write about the report while basically writing about the report in your own voice? And that's the trick. When I normally detect people plagiarizing, the first clue that somebody has plagiarized is I'm reading along and it's the student's voice, and then all of a sudden it's not the student's voice. And then I'm like, hey, what happened there? I mean, it literally like reaches up off the page and slaps me in the face. Because you hear the voice change. As you're reading it and the voice is going through your head, it shifts from one person's voice to another person's voice, and boom, there you have it. Something has happened there. So in your paper, you are summarizing the work of a bunch of people who wrote the National Academy of Science report. Just like in a science paper, when a science student will be writing an introduction, they're reviewing information that was found by previous researchers. They have to summarize that research, but they have to summarize that research in a way that their own individual voice comes through in writing. So in this case, in every one of these examples, the information is information from Young et al. The difference is, what is a valid paraphrase versus what is plagiarism? What do you guys consider to be a valid paraphrase? What you should be striving for is a valid paraphrase.
Probably depends on the length of the article or whatever you're paraphrasing.
Okay, so I gave you a relatively short article so that you could read it. It's a relatively approachable article so that you probably understand it, because we've already talked about natural selection in this class somewhat. So when we go to, here's what I don't like about plagiarism.org. Let me pull up plagiarism.org real quick. In their plagiarism spectrum examples, they actually give students the hardest of all possible tasks, which is, what the heck? Why does it just randomly change on me when I haven't done anything different? Okay. Now, on plagiarism.org, they've given students the hardest task in the world, which is summarize a paragraph in a paragraph. Like, that's just really, really difficult to do, to say, write a paragraph about this paragraph. Like, how are you gonna do that well? But in academic writing, seldom are you being asked to do that. What you're usually being asked to do is take a one-page science paper that is multiple paragraphs and summarize it in a couple of sentences, which is what this task for this student was. In the GMO paper, in the genetically engineered organism paper that you're going to write to Aunt Susie or Uncle Bob, how many pages are those chapters? Chapter 3, 4, 5, and 6. Yeah, I don't remember the exact page counts, but
I think ours was like 70 chapters.
each of those chapters, 3, 4, 5, and 6, they're all probably about 20 to 30 pages long. You're probably summarizing about 100 pages or so of information in how many paragraphs? 5. An introduction to what genetically engineered organisms are and how the technology works. A paragraph on chapter 4, a paragraph on chapter 5, a paragraph on chapter 6, and then a summary paragraph. So you're taking these hundreds of pages of information, you're distilling it down to its essentials, and that's actually, from the standpoint of avoiding plagiarism, that's a much easier task, because you're not doing a paragraph to paragraph paraphrasing of it. So one of the things I don't like about the plagiarism.org examples is that they give you a paragraph and then they ask somebody to write a paraphrase of that paragraph, which is something that you're hardly ever doing in real writing. This task of taking a paper, even though the paper is only a page, and boiling it down to a couple of sentences is a very realistic task that you might have to do in academic writing. So the information from Young et al. Is going to be in the paragraphs. The order might even be somewhat in the paragraph. The order of Young et al. Might be in the paragraph or in the summary that you're writing, simply because that's a kind of a logical way of treating it. The question is the writing of the student actually plagiarized or not? Because the goal of this writing assignment for the student was to summarize Young et al.'s paper in a couple of sentences, in 2 or 3 sentences. So that's what your task is. Your task is to take a 20 or 25 or 30 page chapter and boil it down to a paragraph. Avoiding plagiarism in that scenario is much easier, because if you rely too heavily on the original writing of the original authors, that one paragraph is going to be like 10 pages long. I don't want to paragraph. That would be terrible. So you have to think about, what is it I want to say about these chapters and how do I want to say it? And you're probably going to find yourself able to divorce yourself from the original writing of the report because you're doing this aggregate summary of that information. And that's what this student is attempting to do. In some cases, this student does it well, and in some cases, they don't do it so well. So that's the task. So just because it has the same information doesn't mean that it's plagiarized. It's just a summary of the thing that you're citing. It would be weird to cite something and the summary of the thing that you're citing have nothing to do with the thing that you're citing. That doesn't make any sense. So the reason I created my own set of examples is because this paragraph to paragraph paraphrasing is something that we just don't do in academic writing very much. So back to exercise 2. Yes, it does have a lot of the same information. The question is that information presented in a form that indicates that it's plagiarized or not? And what is it that would make you think that it is plagiarized? My computer doesn't want to cooperate. Now that we've had this conversation, you can maybe look at this with fresher eyes, different eyes. Do you sense a voice change in here anywhere? Where? Julia, you just nodded your head. Where?
I don't know. Left to directional selection that will be the same.
I'm sorry, what was that?
Everywhere.
Oh, everywhere? There's voice changes everywhere?
I mean,
Does the author rearrange the order of things somewhat in this summary? Rearrange the order in which this writer is covering things? Is there anything that looks like a direct quotation from the original article?
Probably this part with the parietal and squamosal forms.
So these are just actually the words that describe what the type of horn is that's being selected against. There was a picture in the paper, so it would be like calling Bob and Ed in a sense. So that's just like appropriate scientific terminology.
I'll need a different example.
Oh, you were gonna need a different example. Okay.
Yeah, the first part is his words, and then the second.
So this sounds like
That's his
one
words.
voice.
Yes.
And then this is sounding maybe like a little less of the voice. Where it really changes for me is starting
The second part of it,
right here.
second end,
Yeah, where does this come from?
article.
Yeah, it comes directly from the article. This is like a direct quote from the article. This is a direct quote from the article. This language down here sounds somewhat different from this language here. It's subtly different because I have a PhD in biology and I'm the student who wrote all these things, and there's a certain degree where I can't not write in my own voice in a sense. But even at that, this is my voice up here. This is definitely Brody and Young's voice here. And I just literally, I wrote out a summary, and then when I got to a part that I wanted to plagiarize, I just cut it and pasted it and stuck it in here. And that's what the website refers to as Control-C. Keep in mind that this student has a PhD in biology, writing these summaries. What do you think of this? What's that?
I guess, I think that you did a good job on like, summarizing the article, but, I mean, you give you credit to the article.
Sure. I mean, that's required.
Yeah, and,
Do you sense a voice change in here anywhere?
Slightly in the last sentence from the rest, this represents on, is slightly different than
Is it?
the beginning.
Yeah. So just so you know, on this one, I sat down at my computer and I just wrote this. This is my brain that you're seeing right here. It's not in exactly the same order that they cover things in the original paper. It goes into less detail in a lot of places than the original thing does because once again, it's just meant to be a summary. I would consider this a valid paraphrase. Once again, unfortunately, I don't really know how to talk like a first-year undergraduate because I've been away from first-year undergraduateness for a while. But I would consider this to be a valid paraphrase. It's just a really well-written, valid paraphrase. And there are times when I will, especially when I first get to know students in a class, and in my biology classes, they write a lot for me. And the first time that I read papers, there are some students in the class who are just really not very good at writing yet. And then there's some students who really latched on to writing. They either had really good training in high school or it just is something that comes kind of naturally to them. And they're really good writers. And I'm reading the paper, I'm like, damn, that's good writing. And then I'm like, damn, that's really good writing. And then I begin to get suspicious. Why is the writing so good? And then if I see any phrases and stuff that look sketchy to me, I'll go and look at the original article that they're writing. In the writing assignments in that class, we take an entire paper that may be 5 or 10 pages long, and they distill it down to a page and a half summary. And if I don't see anything after I've gone back and reread the article, I've read these articles a lot because it's something that we teach every year. And so I'm really familiar with the articles. And then when I go back and say, oh, that's really good writing, that's exactly how we want students to be writing, I'll go back and revisit the article. And then if everything looks fine, I'm like, okay, you're just a really nicely refined writer, and that's great. So actually, the better you write, the harder it is sometimes to detect plagiarism simply because the writing is so good. But oftentimes, when you have a really good writer, you don't ever detect any plagiarism because the person is a good writer and doesn't do that. And so, first year writing, which is where I normally find most examples of plagiarism, it's really easy to detect because they're already just struggling with the writing process anyway. So that when it shifts from writing that reads like it's uncomfortable, like it's an uncomfortable process for the person to be writing, and then it shifts into really nice, fluent writing, it's like, whoa, that's not the same person writing as was writing this other stuff. As you get older, your writing just gets better, and it just reads more and more like professional writing, and that's good. But then it's harder to see shifts in voice because you've learned how to write academically as a result of being in college. So I wrote this just sitting at my computer with my favorite beverage in hand and spit this out onto the page. Now, I've read this journal article, which is only one page, probably 30 or 40 times, so I can remember certain details, like how many generations it took for this to occur, simply because I'm very familiar with it, but the rest of it, I challenge you to find much in it that is kind of directly or too closely lifted from the original paper. What about this one? Once again, it's useful to have the original paper next to you when you're doing this exercise. When you see this part here, and then you see this part here again, what does that possibly indicate to you? That was maybe not copied and pasted, but that was probably in the original article once, and this person is actually attempting to rephrase that, and because they're not very good at attempting to rephrase that, they end up putting it into the thing twice. When you go to the original article, you will see that's the reason. That's what happens. Okay. Randomness of the computer. Well, where's the original article? You'll see predation is difficult to document in the wild. Some predators leave behind explicit records of individual predation events. When you go to the actual summary here, what they're doing is they're just putting in synonyms for those words that are in the original thing. So this first sentence, for example, has exactly the same structure as the first two sentences of that one paragraph. They've just put in synonyms for words that are in the original. This is a really common form of plagiarism. Probably the most common form of plagiarism that I ever see is what I used to refer to as substitution plagiarism, where you basically take the original text and you just take out the original words and put in synonyms for it. The bad thing for science students in particular, you guys, it won't be this way for you as much. The bad thing for science students, my biology students, when they do this, is that oftentimes the words that we use in science, they may be the same words that regular people use, but the scientific use of the word is totally different than the regular person use of the word, so that when they put these synonyms into the sentence ends up making no sense scientifically because of the different usages of the words. And so once again, that's another thing that really jumps off the page at you. Substitution plagiarism is almost well, it is the most common form of plagiarism that I see in my early biology students' work. And it's because when they use these substituted words, when they go to the thesaurus to find a new word to put in place of the word that's already there, it just totally changes the meaning of the sentence. And so that's bad. And that's what this student is doing. This student is doing it successfully. The sentence still means the same thing that it meant before, but it really is just an act of doing that. There are actually a bunch of different kinds of plagiarism. This first two sentences is just find and replace, taking out one word that means one thing and putting a new word in there that means the same thing. This section, once again, whenever you see something like full standard deviation, that's not the kind of language that you would expect most students to use, unless they're a really advanced student. So that's just a simple copy and paste. And then the retweet is, I forgot to bring my notes. What is the retweet in plagiarism.org's way of thinking about this? Remix.
At the way bottom.
Is it at the bottom? I wrote these down on a sheet of paper before I came into class, and then. Oh yeah. So it's once again, it's just it's properly cited and everything. It just relies too closely on kind of the structure or the original wording of the original things. It's just too close to the original in a way.
And that would be without quotation, like had that been
Yeah.
quotations and cited?
Then that would have been fine, yeah. Once again, I would have been irritated at the use of a direct quote, but I wouldn't have done anything about it. So one of the things that you also need to understand about me is that plagiarism is just a pain in the ass. It requires paperwork. And I don't want to fill out the paperwork. So how many of y'all have gone through some formal training in plagiarism and how to avoid plagiarism while you've been at William Jewell College? What is that?
Been touched on.
Yeah.
Been touched on. Have you spent a full 65 minutes on it ever?
No.
Okay. Go slap all the rest of your professors. I don't like plagiarism for a variety of reasons. The main reason, well, okay, that's not true. One big reason that I don't like it is I don't like the paperwork that's involved. It's just a pain. And I would rather avoid it in the first place than try and deal with it afterwards. I have other reasons that I want you to write in ways that aren't plagiarized, but the whole paperwork thing is part of it. What about this last one?
That's straight up plagiarism.
Why do you say that, Cameron?
Because at the beginning of the sentence, it wasn't cited or anything, but like the directional selection, that's straight from the article.
Once again, directional selection is just a common term in science.
So
which
like
is
some
why-
of that sentence, a lot of it is straight from one
Okay.
part.
I think I might have gotten this wrong because I was redoing my key. Yeah, what's the big problem? What's the biggest problem with this?
No sources cited.
There's no source cited. So the key is wrong. I'll correct this before I post this on Moodle. This would definitely be dogging you for plagiarism because there is no source cited. Beyond that, it's actually not a terrible paraphrase. It's unfortunate that they have a factual error. They switched which horns did what. And this last one is a little too close to the original wording than I would like to see, but it's probably not so close to the original wording that I would probably change the student's grade on it. So plagiarism it's a slippery little bastard in a way. Because for a faculty member to file an honor code violation on a student about plagiarism, I think the faculty member should be just pretty darn solid about, yes, this is plagiarism. And so I think when we file honor code violations for plagiarism, it's usually the most egregious forms of plagiarism. As I was looking at this yesterday in preparation for today, I noticed that in the time that I've been teaching, plagiarism.org came into existence, and then they've gone through a couple of iterations of kind of this taxonomy of plagiarism. And when I was looking at the website yesterday after I sent you the email, I went back to plagiarism.org and was making notes to get ready for today. And I noticed that they have a new, I scrolled down to the bottom, it's like Plagiarism Spectrum 2.0. I'm like, okay, well, what is that about? And it's actually much closer to their original plagiarism spectrum. And I actually kind of like the way they did it. So even though I didn't direct you to this, I'm going to direct you to this now because there are some things that I like about it. Because plagiarism is a spectrum. It's not an either or thing necessarily. There are stages of severity of plagiarism. And I like that they've kind of put it on this sort of continuous scale from original thinking, which is what we want you to be doing. In each of the chapters that you're gonna, or in each of the paragraphs that you're gonna write on each of these chapters, you're gonna be doing a certain amount of summarizing, but you're also going to be doing a certain amount of interpretation, a certain amount of repackaging that information to Aunt Susie, who doesn't know squat about any of this stuff. So your job in this paper is to be an interpreter of the science that is in the report to a person who is scientifically illiterate. There's nothing wrong with being scientifically illiterate, it just means that you don't have a good background in science. I am illiterate in poetry. I am illiterate in physics. I am ignorant of all kinds of things. I am really knowledgeable about biology. I am relatively ignorant about political science, especially the theories that undergird political science. I know more about economics than the normal person, largely because I have to teach this class and we have to teach about economics in this class. So for every person, you're ignorant about a wide diversity of things and you're pretty knowledgeable about other things. That's kind of the nature of being an educated American in the 21st century. So you're going to be summarizing for a scientifically uneducated person, a person who's not been exposed to these ideas, what these ideas are. And that requires you to rely on those ideas, but it requires you to use your own creative thought to figure out the best way of repackaging those ideas so that they would make sense to somebody who hasn't taken this class and hasn't been forced unwillingly to read those chapters. And that's your task. And it's a task that every scientist has to deal with. If you ever listen to a scientist, especially in the age of COVID, you listen to these scientists that are asked to be interviewed on news programs and stuff about the COVID pandemic. Some of them are really good at communicating with the public, and some of them suck at it. And it's because we don't ever really get trained in how to do that. As we're coming up through scientists, we get trained on how to do science. And so this act of translating to a non-scientific audience takes some skill and takes some practice. You guys have to do it without nearly the amount of skill and nearly the amount of practice, which is why the paper's not going to be due until after Thanksgiving. Which is also why we had you go through and start thinking about these chapters long before you actually have to sit down and write about them. So this way of looking at plagiarism is actually kind of more productive because it goes all the way from good things to really, really bad things. And so, for example, in my first year class, I tell my students at the very beginning of class, when you plagiarize on a paper, I don't think you're a terrible person. I think you didn't ever get trained in how to write. And I think that's largely true of my first year biology students. I already had to have a meeting with the student over a plagiarized paper in Bio 133. The student came into my office. I asked her to explain what exactly went on with her paper, what her writing process was like, and she burst out crying. I'm like, why are you crying? Well, I don't want you to think that I'm a terrible person. I'm like, why would I think you're a terrible person? I hardly know you. Like, I've had you for half a semester in one class. I really don't know hardly anything about you. This meeting is about the fact that you don't know how to write. So dry your tears, forget the fact that I might think something about you as a human being. I just think we need to work on your writing abilities, and that's why I'm meeting with you. You have a problem with your writing, we need to fix that problem with your writing. I also tell them in that first year class, when you get to be a junior and I see you in my animal behavior class, and you plagiarize there, I'm gonna begin to think that you're a terrible human being because we train our students actually. We actually formally train our biology majors. In every class that you take in the first 4 courses that you take as a biology major, there is a section where we teach you about writing and where we give you a different example of how to learn about plagiarism in a different writing task that is designed to help them learn how to write without plagiarizing. We're very formal about it in my major, which your majors seem to not be for whatever reason. So by the time they get to be juniors and seniors, we've trained them to write in ways that avoid plagiarism. And so when we do see it in the upper levels, we are a little more judgy about it than we are in the first year courses. But there are also different levels of plagiarism. Student collusion is on this, so it's just basically like Cameron writes his paper and Julia steals it and changes her name and turns it in as if it's hers. That's, I guess, technically plagiarism because Julia's taking credit for Cameron's work without citing Cameron for having written the paper for her. I actually don't think of that as plagiarism, I think of that as cheating. And when I file an honor code violation on that, I will not file it as an example of plagiarism, I would file that as an example of cheating, which I do think is like pretty like you're a bad person kind of behavior. Sorry, Julia. But then a lot of the rest of the stuff is actually plagiarism, word for word plagiarism, where you're copying and pasting. A lot of times you put off doing the assignment until the end, you get rushed, you need to pump it out, and so you fall into the trap of using the original author's words, word for word, without putting them in quotes or without citing them. Inadvertent plagiarism is probably also pretty common, especially if you're doing a writing assignment that takes information from lots of different sources. When I write a paper, if I'm writing a paper for a journal publication or something like this, My particular writing style is that I try and read a lot. So in my writing process, I will read a lot without writing anything, and I will kind of load my brain up with all the information that I need to have in my brain about the topic that I'm writing about, and then I will start writing. And when I get to the end of a sentence, I will put a open parentheses with a space between them, and then I will continue writing, and then put open parentheses, and then continue writing, and put open parentheses, and continue writing, and put open parentheses. And then when I'm done writing, and the reason that I do this, I don't want to stop while I'm writing to go in and put in citations, because one of the things that I concentrate on when I'm writing is the flow of ideas, and make sure that the ideas that I'm trying to get across flow in a logical manner and are well connected from one idea to the next idea in the introduction, for example, of a scientific paper. And so I don't bother with where the information came from while I'm in the process of writing. But once I have that down on paper, I have all of these things. I can then do a find and replace for open parentheses, space, close parentheses. I just go and find and replace. I find where all of those are, and then as the computer finds them, I just put in the citations. Oh, I got the ideas from this sentence from this set of sources. I got the ideas in this sentence from this set of sources. And then I go in and add those in afterwards. That keeps me from forgetting something. Like forgetting, oh, this idea is not original to me. I need to have a citation there. So when I write, I know what's my original ideas and what are not, and so I leave myself little place markers so that I know to go back and add those things in afterwards. I was writing a paper with a Juul student one summer, and we sent it off to the journal. They sent it back, and one of the comments of one of the reviewers was, on page 22, second paragraph, line 4, there's an open parentheses with nothing in it. I'm like, oh, missed that one. So that's even, sometimes those do slip through, and we went in and added in the correct citations there. So you can commit plagiarism just because you missed something. You didn't intend to do it, you just missed it. And that's why this is on the much further on the good scale of the scale than the truly rotten end of this scale. Word for word plagiarism, especially in students, a lot of times it's just that you're pushed for time and you just took shortcuts, and that's fine also, but you should give yourself a sufficient amount of time. Self-plagiarism is weird for me. This is one of the ones that is in the plagiarism spectrum that I gave you a link to, and that was also in this one. It's when you plagiarize yourself, so you quote something out of something that you wrote earlier, but you don't cite yourself. And the reason that I think it's weird is that in academic writing, one of the ways that people gauge whether you're doing good science, for example, is if other people are citing you. And so it actually pays for you to cite yourself when you actually cite yourself, because when algorithms look at citations for a particular paper that you've written in the past, it doesn't really pay attention to whether it's the original author citing him or herself. It's just another citation for that paper that you wrote 10 years ago that you're referring back to. So it actually is kind of self-defeating to self-plagiarize, because you're not giving you credit for your own past work. So I don't get that, why people would even do that, but that is a category. Mosaic plagiarism is also pretty common and super hard to detect, because it's when you take information from lots of different sources, combine them all together in one sentence, and then if you haven't cited where all those things came from, it might look like a really well-crafted sentence that is just a bunch of things cobbled together from maybe 4 different sentences in 4 different publications. It's almost impossible to detect if it's done well, but that once again is more on this side of the scale, because if you're doing that, like, you're working pretty hard to plagiarize. And if you're working that hard to plagiarize, you might as well just work hard doing what?
Right.
Writing your own stuff. This is also on the bad in what they call source-based plagiarism, where you basically take information from one source, put a citation for another source, so that if somebody goes back and looks for it in the source that you cited, they can't find that exact verbiage because it isn't actually from the source that you cited, it's actually from some other source that you didn't cite. That then begins to have the signals of you're actually trying to play fast and loose with the rules, you're being devious about what you are. And then, yeah, that's why it's kind of more on this end of the spectrum, from you're a rotten human being to you're sloppy and pressed for time to you just made a simple mistake to you did your actual original work. And so this is kind of the way that I view plagiarism in my mind when I see different types of plagiarism. Once again, the kind that I see most often is one that's not even up here, which isn't up here, which is substitution plagiarism, putting in synonyms. But once again, you know, that's oftentimes the sign that you are pressed for time and you're taking shortcuts. So don't leave yourself too little time to work on a project, and you will easily avoid that. So we're taking this thing all in the wrong order. The whole purpose of today is to teach you a little bit about plagiarism, and here in a minute I'll teach you a way to write that guarantees that you can't plagiarize. So then the question is, why not plagiarize? It's so much easier to write that way. Other than the fact that clearly Dr. Kowinski is against plagiarism. Why not do it?
It's illegal.
It's not illegal. Nobody's, well, nah, I
It
guess.
definitely is legal.
I guess it is illegal, isn't it? I'm not a lawyer.
100%. Yes.
Are you planning on going to law school?
No, I mean, I just took like classes like copyright law and like
Oh,
stuff
okay.
like that, which are very.
It is illegal. I don't know that anybody's ever gonna prosecute a
No.
college student for plagiarism. You guys know Stephen Ambrose?
That sounds familiar, man.
Stephen Ambrose wrote a book. Have you ever heard of a book called Undaunted Courage? It's a book about the Lewis and Clark expedition. Oh, evidently he plagiarized portions of it. Created a huge stink, kind of ended his writing career. I don't think he ever got sued for it, but man, they ripped him up in the press. And after that, he couldn't get anybody to publish another one of his books. And his books were pretty well regarded in both academic circles and in just regular popular reading circles. So yes, it is illegal. Nobody's ever gonna prosecute you for plagiarizing in a college classroom. Why else? So why not plagiarism aside from the illegal part of things?
You're unable to like really show what you know or have learned.
You're unable to show what you've learned, and that's one of the things that we're supposed to be assessing about you, and it's impossible to assess that if you've plagiarized. What else? Why else would you not just go ahead and plagiarize? Because plagiarizing is easy.
I mean, there's the ethical issue of not, of more or less stealing someone's work and taking credit for it.
Yes, and we would like you to be ethical human beings. Why else? I can't assess what you understand if you plagiarize. Guess what happens when you rely too heavily on the original author's work and as a result fall into the trap of plagiarism? From the standpoint of you developing as a student, you developing as a scholar, you developing as an informed citizen.
If you plagiarize, you just don't have to think really.
You don't have to think.
You don't learn anything.
You can plagiarize your whole life away, and guess what you will never understand? Anything that you've ever read or written about. Plagiarism, the reason that I don't like plagiarism is because plagiarism is a barrier to understanding. When I see first-year biology students plagiarize, the first thing that goes through my mind is you didn't understand the paper that you're trying to summarize. Because if you did understand the paper you were trying to summarize, guess what?
You would just summarize.
You would just summarize it in your own words. I mean, we wouldn't have the difficult conversation in my office where we cry. So the first step in writing is understanding the things that you're reading. If you can't do that, then you're done in terms of the writing assignment, which is one of the reasons that I made an activity where you needed to present these chapters to one another early enough that I get you interacting with the text early enough that you're not coming at this cold reading, next week sometime. Hopefully you've read your own chapter that your group was supposed to summarize, and hopefully you've started reading the other chapters that the other groups summarized. Hopefully their summaries preloaded the information somewhat for you so that when you approach those chapters, you're not approaching those chapters cold, you're approaching those chapters with at least a little bit of knowledge about those chapters. So plagiarism is a barrier to understanding. So the first thing to do when you write in ways that avoid plagiarism is to understand things. So the reason that we as faculty, especially in the biology department, want to discourage plagiarism is because we want to encourage understanding. So I have a foolproof method for writing without plagiarism. And if you follow it to the letter, you will write brilliant papers. They will be well written, they will not be plagiarized, and they will communicate to the faculty member who is reading them that you are brilliant and that you understand the things that you are reading very well. Step one. Read the source material until you understand it. You're never going to read, especially if it's primary literature, if it's the primary journal articles and things like this in your field, you're not going to probably understand everything in that paper the first time you read it. If you read the National Academy of Sciences GMO report, you're not going to understand everything in those chapters the first time you read it. Hopefully you'll understand more of it because we've covered many of those topics in class, you saw your peers present about it, etc. But there's probably still going to be things in there that you don't understand. If you don't understand it the first time you read it, guess what? Read it again. If you still find things in there that you don't understand, go and see if you can find something online that helps you understand, and by all means, read it a third time. When my biology 133 students come to me to ask me a question about the literature that we ask them to read, the first thing that I ask them is, how many times have you read the paper before you came to see me? And they all know that the correct answer is 3, whether 3 is true or not. Because if it's anything less than 3, guess what I do for them? Nothing. I send them back to read the paper again. Once they've read the paper 2 or 3 times and there's still things in the paper that they don't understand, come to me. I will sit down and I will work through and get them to the point that they understand whatever it is that they don't understand. Because the first step in writing a paper is understanding. As you read the GMO report, read it for understanding. You can take notes at this stage, but you only need to take notes at this stage to note what are the things that you're reading that you don't understand. So you should generally read without a writing instrument. Once you've read the source material enough that you think you understand it, lock the original source in a filing cabinet, throw the key away, and then sit down and take notes. Summarize the thing that you think you understand while the original source is someplace else. under your sleeping roommate, in a locked filing cabinet, I don't care where it is, just get it out of sight of view. Take notes. Now your notes are gonna be what? They're gonna be in your own words. Now, your notes may be terrible at this stage, and that's fine. But what they are is they're in your voice now, because you didn't even have the paper anywhere near you. Step 3. Go to the filing cabinet, get the source, put the writing instrument in the filing cabinet, and then compare the notes to the source. It's a bummer because you're going to find that your notes don't match what's in the source, and you don't have a way to note those because you locked your writing instrument in the filing cabinet. But what it does by not having your writing instrument in your hand is it prevents you from updating your notes while the source is sitting right there. Those areas where your notes don't match the information that is in the source, concentrate on those parts. Ignore the parts where it does match. Concentrate on those parts and say, okay, I'm not understanding this part of the original source. I need to correct the notes on this part of the source. Concentrate on that section of the source. Once you think you understand that part of the source, go back to step 2. Put the source back in the filing cabinet, get your writing instrument back out, and go and now update your notes. Repeat that process as many times as you can until you have a set of notes that reflect what is in the source, but those notes are entirely written in your own voice because when you wrote them, you didn't even have the article sitting next to you. At this point now, you have a set of notes. At this point, do you need the original source at all? No, you don't, because presumably your notes reflect what is in the source. It reflects them accurately, and it reflects them in your own voice. So now you need to get ready to write the paper. Chances are, especially if you're writing a paper, like a research paper or an academic paper where you're relying on sources from lots of different sources, information from lots of different sources, you may have notes from source 1, notes from source 2, notes from source 3, notes from source 4. Those things all go into the final paper, not necessarily source 1, source 2, source 3, and source 4. You might draw something from source 1, then from source 3, then from source 2, then from source 4, and then in the next paragraph you might start with something from source 4, leading to something from source 2, source 3, source 1. And so when I was just starting out writing, when I took a technical writing class when I was an undergraduate, the professor taught us to take our notes and just cut them up, and then put them on a board or something in the order that we wanted to be covering those topics in our final paper. And they would be, we took them in different colors so that you could identify what source was which from the color that you took the notes in, and things like this. And then, once you had your kind of notes all arranged the way you want to cover them in the paper, the next step is, so arrange your notes. Then read your notes until you understand them in the context of your overall paper. And so now you're reading your own notes in the same way that you read the original source. I have these original sources, I have them in this order. I need to understand those sources now in the context of the paper that I'm writing, not the papers that I was reading. Once you understand your notes, you're done with all the prep. Oh, I've lost track of what steps I am. Lock your notes away and sit down and write. Grab your favorite beverage, grab your computer, find a quiet place, and just sit down and write. At this point, what's coming out of your head is what's locked in your head. You're 2 steps removed from the original source. At this point, if you write this way, there is no way in hell that you can plagiarize. It's just impossible. Like, it's physically impossible unless you have an eidetic memory, which is so rare that I'm pretty sure none of us have. Photographic memory. Any of you guys have photographic memory? Oh, you do? Oh,
No,
thought you did.
I thought you were asking if we understood what you're talking
Yeah.
about.
Unless you have photographic memory, it's impossible to plagiarize under these conditions. But the cool thing about writing this way is that when you sit down to write that final version, that version of your paper that you're going to turn in, what do you have going for you?
Original thoughts,
Original thoughts, original ideas, and the thoughts of yours that are not original, guess what? You will understand those things fully. So the advantage of writing this way is, 1, it's impossible to plagiarize. 2, it's almost impossible to not write a good paper, unless you're just a really terrible writer. And even if you're a terrible writer, you might have bad sentence construction and things like this, but what you won't have is you won't have information in the paper that is incorrect. You won't have information in the paper that you don't understand. This accomplishes 2 goals. It accomplishes the goal of avoiding honor code violations, and it also encourages the broader goal of you understanding what you're reading. All that said, if there's still things in the National Academy of Sciences report that you don't understand, and I'm probably pretty sure that there are things in there that you don't understand, ask about them at the beginning of class next time I see you on Friday. Because chances are, if you don't understand it, somebody else in the class doesn't understand it. We'll go through it in class. I'm totally down with that. If you don't understand it, you want to come see me in my office, come see me in my office. I'll spend as much time as you need to get you to understand that. The guidelines for the GMO report paper are on the Moodle site in this week's materials. There's a description of that. I'll go through that in detail next time at the beginning of class. There are also some readings from Poland that I want you to read between now and Friday. I'll post those on Moodle as well, probably in the next hour or so. All right, I'll see you guys Friday, I guess.
Wait, I think Victor.
Oh, yeah, sorry. I saw cameras come out earlier. I thought everybody had already snapped it. I also have this written up,
Okay.
and I'll post that on the Moodle. I wrote it up a number of years ago for my Bio 133 students, so I'll just do that again for you guys.